So we're going to talk about the English language. We're also going to talk about how we can break down that language to decode it through phonology and morphology, and then dip into kind of vocabulary and how morphology can help us not just with the decoding aspects, but also with the meaningful aspects, which is probably obvious as well. I do want to say this is not an agenda. We're going to be touching on these different aspects of it throughout each task that we do, because morphology and phonology are so intertwined. It's not going to be one after the other. So I want to start, though, with thinking about the complexities of the English language. And I'm going to start at the beginning of time, but we're not going to stay there for very long. It just helps to think about how English became a language and how our brains have been used for language. So brain evolution started about 100,000 years ago, probably a little bit more. And when you're thinking about that, we've evolved in a lot of ways, but oral language has always been a piece of that brain. And the difference is our reading brain hasn't been developed for written language. That's only been about 15,000 years, and that wasn't even for written language in the way that we think of it now. So our brain is really programmed specifically to speak and see and think, but we aren't programmed to read. And that comes from Marianne Wolf. Though Stanislaus Dehaene has also talked about how the brain has developed and how that wiring has changed over time. Reading is really about our ability to reconnect and use other parts of our brain for reading in particular. And our languages have developed quite a bit over time. So if we look at these kind of early aspects of language, they started out as pictograms, like hieroglyphics, and that has developed over a great amount of time, and even became the Phoenician alphabet, which was considered sort of our English's great grandfather alphabet. Whereas there's different set logographs like Chinese radicals, which developed over thousands of years. And instead of being more of a pictorial representation where you can see the bird, you have more of an abstract representation with radicals. And many of these are still a part of current Chinese characters that make up the language. Other forms of language that we have are syllabaries. So where the symbol represents a syllable instead of a sound, or an alphabet. And when you think about so we're an alphabetic language, but there are two different aspects of an alphabetic language that we maintain. So looking at this, we have in this first section right here, there's a bunch of different languages, 5, and these are the sounds that are in those languages. So if we look, just looking at Italian versus English. In Italian, we have, that's the red. There are about 25-ish, I'm probably off a little bit on the sounds that are in the Italian language. And it's almost a one-to-one correspondence. So I think it's something like, I think there's actually 28 sounds and there are 21 spellings of those sounds. Versus English, which has 44 sounds approximately in this gray. And then we jump over and we have over 360 spellings. And so we're really talking about spelling each individual sound within the English language in multiple ways. If you think just about spelling the sound I, so that vowel sound can be spelled in lots of different ways. It has two different words that are spelled. So an I by itself spells that sound. EYE also spells that sound. But there are also various ways the Y can say the sound I. There are lots of different ways that we can represent that. And that's just one single sound. We have many of those that happen in the English language. So English is a deep orthography, meaning that it's morphophonemic. So English is not just represented by sounds, it's also represented by morphemes. So if we pull apart the word morphophonemic and we look at the morphemes that are in that word, we have morpho or morph, and that is one aspect. We have phoneme, the other aspect, and then we have ick. So we have three morphemes in this word, basically saying that we use morphemes, we use sounds, and ick means that it's an adjective. So those endings are sometimes a little bit more abstract, but they help us understand parts of speech. And then phonology is the way that we break down words into sounds and syllables. It would take me much longer to go through every single sound in morphophonemic, but if we looked at the syllables, we have mor, pho, pha, ni, mic. So we have 5 different syllables, even though only 3 morphemes, because those meaningful parts are fewer within there. But to help a student break down the word and able to read it, it sometimes helps to go to that syllable level, because that will enable them to chunk it into smaller pieces that they can decode. And besides a few little things, it's fairly decodable when you have more, pho, pha, that's where we get that schwa, and it's a little bit more tricky, ni, mic. So we really only have one syllable as long as you know that PH says sound. That is a little trickier for us. And this is just to reiterate that our language is not as crazy as it feels or seems. And I think it really helps to talk with kids about it not being incredibly crazy, and that a lot of it is explainable and learnable. We're not going to ever learn every single aspect of the rules of the English language. But for the most part, our language can be explained, and that can help our students really understand how to break down words. So 50% of all English words are specifically decodable based on expected pronunciation. Another 36, and I actually just read an article that says 37%, it's just one single sound that is not what is expected. And usually that's the vowel. So we can even determine where we're expecting to have that more difficulty. And only 4% are truly irregular. That allows us to really think about that these words aren't as crazy as they feel. This predictability, though, is based not solely on sound. It's based on the understanding that we have different spelling patterns, that there are word meanings, as in morphemes, and etymology that helps us understand where these spellings and sounds are coming from. So there is a lot to know, but it's knowable. And the other caveat I should add here, everything that I've looked at, books, webinars about morphology, has basically said, you're not going to know everything, and don't wait until you do. you sort of have to jump in and start to figure it out because there's so much to know. Just make your selections really thoughtfully, especially as you're starting. So I also want to think about the 4-part processing model. This started from Seidenberg and McClellan, and this graphic itself is an interpretation from Louisa Moats and Carol Tolman. So this helps us understand, it's a model that was created to help think about how our brains process reading. And it was created back in 1989 before we were able to scan brains and actually see what was happening. But since then, it has been validated through those brain scans that this is really where we see different areas of our brain working that are using these aspects. So in the 4-part processing model, we have phonology down in the bottom and orthography connected to it. That's the base of our language and where we should always start. Connecting those two, going back and forth, that's the phonics activities. So really solidifying that base is the most important part. And I should say, I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about morphology today, and that is not because I think it is more important than phonics. In fact, we really need to have a solid foundation of phonics to help make it work. We can't rely more heavily on meaning. But there are a lot of ways that we can incorporate morphology even early on in the literacy instruction that allow students to get more in depth with understanding a word, not just from a sound symbol area, and that actually strengthens their ability to hold that word and keep it as a really solid foundation and part of their vocabulary, which is one of the core aspects of reading comprehension. After we have that base, we do also have to connect it to meaning. So as you're reading, you're really taking in the sounds based on the letters that you're seeing and connecting that meaningful piece. Connected to meaning is also context. Notice that context is only connected to the meaning part of this processing model, not to the decoding piece. So we're not using context to help us decode, we're using context to help us understand meaning. So for instance, if I saw the word bug, my phonological processor would break down those sounds, b, g, connected to the letters that I'm seeing, a one-to-one correspondence, B, U, G. And those would go back and forth, kind of quickly activating my ability to say the word that I'm seeing. And then I would have meaning associated to that automatically. The most common meaning of the word bug is the insect. So that's probably kind of the visual I'm getting in my head at this time. But if I recognize that the context of my book is actually talking about spies, I'm going to have a different connection to that meaning. It doesn't change how I'm sounding out the word, but it does significantly change my understanding of the word. So I want to take a word now that is probably, if you're anything like me a few years ago, I had never heard of this word before until I went through the letters training and learned this as a new vocabulary word for me. So we're going to think about this word based on all of these different areas of the processor, keeping in mind that this is about word recognition. So we are really able to use this as that helps us build our phonological and orthographic processing and helping us build meaning. So we're going to start down here in this phonics range where now I have it broken down into my syllables. And there's a little bit of flexing that I need to do, but I know some specific patterns here that allow me to most accurately read each syllable as im, pa, q, ni, us. That pa, where I have the schwa syllable, is the only one that really needs significant flexing. But there are some signs that I can't quite get into in an hour's worth of time with some other goals. But there's some predictability in how we say each of those syllables. And I'm able to break down these different pieces based on the letters that I'm seeing and the sounds that I'm expecting. So now I can pronounce that word as impecunious, but it probably isn't something that is very recognizable at this point if you don't have some meaning. So that's where morphology can step in and kind of help us out. Many of us know that im means not, so I'm expecting this to be not something. Us also tells me that it's an adjective, so it's going to be a describing word. You do have to have a little bit of higher level processing going on to know, and higher level background knowledge to know that pecunia means money. The only thing that I recognized previous to this was a pecuniary fund, which I know is some sort of fund, which usually has money in it, but I didn't have a strong background. But based on these clues, some of which I had to be told, I know that this basically means a describing word meaning not money. A synonym is poor. And then we can put, oops, I skipped that. We can put that word into context, describing an impecunious person searching through their wallet, which happened to be empty. That would help us kind of understand that word more. After the reason that I was so sold on this model previously is I've never really seen this word beyond this moment or that moment of being taught it, but I have remembered it forever. And that to me was a powerful recognition of how we can help bring that to students.